Hey, what's happening everyone? Welcome back to the channel. If you're a returning viewer, hey, how you going? Thanks for coming back. If you're new here, my name's Harry and I'm a wannabe med student in Australia. So over the last few years, I have read a lot of books, right? I've read a lot of books on learning and productivity, that whole spiel. And I feel like I've developed a pretty good way to learn content. And as well as that, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding on how to learn new content specifically. And I didn't really have a good way to kind of put this into words and a good way to actually explain this to another person until just the other day, I stumbled across this really nice blog post. And it basically put in writing everything that I had been implementing over the last 3, maybe 4 years of my university studies, but I just didn't quite get how to explain that to somebody else. So basically, this video is just going to be me explaining how I learn new content and a bit of the science behind it as well that I picked up from this blog post. So hopefully you find this all pretty interesting, and hey, maybe you find it worthwhile to actually use when you're studying for your exams or studying in general. Cool. So I'll see you on the other side. So essentially, learning new content, for the purposes of this video anyway, is going to be structured into a 3-part system. And it's a 3-part system that I like to call the MSG Framework. So all the steps in this framework will utilize active recall and spaced repetition, because as I've mentioned before on this channel, they are the best evidence-based ways to learn and to study. So if you're not sure what active recall or spaced repetition are, basically active recall is just asking yourself questions about the content so that you can kind of recall it from your brain. And then spaced repetition is pretty much just that. It's just spacing the time between each time you study effectively. So the 3 parts of this framework are, we have a mnemonic, we have structuralization, and then we have generative learning. So a mnemonic, as I'm sure all of you really know, it's essentially just being able to link information to like an image or linking a word to some graphical interpretation of it. We all would have used like acronyms for studying for something just to kind of help us remember and visualize it in our head. That's exactly what a mnemonic is. So for example, whenever I have to do a respiratory status assessment on a patient in the back of the truck, or whether I have to recite it for an assessment at uni, and a respiratory status assessment is just basically assessing like the patient's ability to speak, and like if there's any wheezes, you have to auscultate their lungs and have a listen to see if there's any crackles, if there's any fluid in there, if they've got any extra work of breathing, those sorts of things. So whenever I have to try and recall that and make sure I'm going through each individual step, I always just visualize the acronym ASREPS in my mind. And that way I can go through each letter systematically every single time and make sure that I'm hitting all of those criteria. 1, so that I'm doing a thorough assessment, and 2, so that I don't miss a step and then fail an assessment at university. Mnemonics work really well for helping us remember stuff. And the science behind that is that there's actually 3 key principles associated with a successful mnemonic, and that is dual coding, organization, and association. So dual coding basically involves learning the content through different mediums. So say you'd learn it verbally, like through speaking it, and then non-verbally through writing it down or making a picture, so that way you can associate the 2 things together whenever you need. Whenever I then have to do an RSA, I just visualize right in my head that ASREPS. Is anyone else getting super like really weird vibes around here? Anyway, visualize that ASREPS and I can see each individual letter in my mind, and I know that I can associate the first A with appearance, and then the first S with sounds, and the second S with speech, and so on and so on. And that way I can go through it thoroughly, and it also means that I learn it and remember it just always and always. We then have organization and association, and those 2 can essentially just be grouped together because they pretty much go hand in hand with the same thing. Essentially, these 2 concepts together just involve the idea of, if we strongly associate all of the info we need to recall with this specific image in our brain, it means that all of that information is essentially stored in this one box, meaning that whenever we need to retrieve it, we can just retrieve it from that same place, therefore just making it overall much easier. Plus, if we're always recalling that information from that same spot over and over, we then are kind of subtly implementing active recall and spaced repetition as well, which is just another bonus. This next step basically just involves getting that information and then putting it into some form of structure. So it doesn't matter what that is. It can be like a mind map, it can be a flowchart, it can be an illustration that you've made of the human body and you've outlined each parts of it. It doesn't matter what it is, it just, as long as you're putting it down on a piece of paper in some graphical nature, because essentially this is an excellent way to further conceptualize the idea and the concept and create like a visual display of the information. As well as this, it also helps to further group that information into its own little box so that you're always visualizing it within the scope of this illustration that you've made, or this flowchart, or this diagram. So not only are we then still keeping it together and drawing it from the same place in our brain, but we're also further strengthening and developing this non-verbal aspect of dual coding. And this works really well, especially if you're like a visual learner as well, because I need pictures, I need some diagrams or illustrations to kind of help me understand, and I need to physically see or physically touch something to be able to learn it and develop like the skills or the understanding of what needs to actually be done. So if you're a visual learner or something, this is a great way for you to really get a head start in having to learn something new, because you're able to really properly fully visualize it in your head. I find that it just makes it so much easier to learn a new concept. Like, especially when I was learning biology for the first time, like the idea that there was a cell, but then inside this cell, which is already microscopic and we can't see it at all, there's these tiny little organelles which are even smaller. And then those tiny little organelles are made of even smaller little proteins and little filaments that make the shape and the function of it. To me, that just absolutely blew my mind, and I couldn't make sense of it in my head. But being able to actually draw out a cell and then being like, okay, so that's the microscopic part, and then draw the organelles which are even smaller, and then do like a cross section of one of those organelles with the structures that are inside it. After I drew it out in that sense and labeled it all up, it was like a light bulb moment. I just clicked. And suddenly I understood it, and it just made so much more sense. The blog also had an article in it as well, which followed a bunch of students from a couple different states in America and compared students who didn't use these graphical measures of studying compared to students who did, and found that they actually performed much worse in exams. Now this is our final lucky last step for learning new content, and essentially it just involves understanding how and why this new content we're trying to learn relates to past content or past information that we've learned in the past. And I find this is actually really important because it gives meaning to why we're learning new content. We've all been in that class, we've all been expected to understand and learn something new, and we've looked at it and just thought it's completely pointless. I'm never going to use this again in my life. Why do I need to learn this? And then we don't put as much effort into it, or we just don't care about it, and it makes it really, really hard to learn it, doesn't it? We just don't have the motivation to commit it to our memory properly. And we either rope learn it and then it fades away, or we just don't bother. And so I think this is actually really important to develop a bit more of an understanding and a reason as to why we're learning this new content and how it fits into like the greater scope of what we're learning overall, so we can fit it in quite nicely and then realize its importance. So I find it's really, really useful to, ask ourselves these questions of like, why are we learning this and how does this fit into the content we've already learned? Because that way we can expand our association of our old information to incorporate this new content that we've received and put it all into one big box. And then we have it. That's basically my routine or my structure for learning new content at university. I'll always try and figure out some way to make it into a mnemonic. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an acronym, but just a way that I can visualize it when speaking it out loud. I'll then try and put that into some kind of picture or some kind of diagram or mind map, because that way, as I mentioned, it really helps conceptualize it. And then just using that generalization again, just asking myself, where does it fit in? How can I use this? Why is this relevant? And it really helps to build a good foundation to want to learn the content and also learn it really, really well. So if you got a lot out of this, guys, make sure to hit that like and subscribe, because it really makes a big difference to the channel. Leave a comment down below about how you learn new content, because I'd love to hear from all of you guys, and I'll definitely check it out after this. And until next time, guys, have a good one, and I'll see you later. See ya.